So I'm going to practice this idea my brother gave to me, and that's the idea of the ability of talking continuously without stopping. And I think it's a good thing because it increases the volume of information your brain is processing at any time, and you are more likely to have a better working brain afterwards if you're able to do it. I'm watching this movie called Bad Moms, which was released last year, and I just got on part B, and I think it is really fun, but I'm a bit silly to be the judge here. Um, it's actually a good movie in the comedian dimension, and I also wanted to talk about an idea that I have for my videos, and it's the idea that instead of having like one, two, three subjects and go into depth into them, I think it's easier and maybe better to have a lot of subjects and go into depth after the feedback and after some thought of my own, after the feedback of the people that watches the video, and they want to say, oh, I want to know more about this, when they are exposed to something that is interesting. And I think it makes things more legitimate and legit, and I have a few ideas. I have the idea that we could discuss the brain in a way that resembles a computer, and I want to talk about a binary emotional state, and that's at any moment you have an emotional state, and it's either happy or sad. And by sad, I mean by sad, I want you to use the word unhappy, because it's easier to associate happy or unhappy. And I see that people with depression have some kind of a third state, and I've been thinking about this after observing some people with ADHD, and they have this, but it's not really depression. It's depression, I guess, is more related to an adult age, and maybe it has some other symptoms. And I think that the medication for depression is basically serotonin, which is it has some hallucinogenic effects. I guess that if I had to choose between the medication that makes you smarter, like Ritalin, which by the way resembles cocaine, or Adderall, which is a set of amphetamines, I'd pick those instead of picking fluoxetine. And that's fluoxetine, which is also sold by the name of and it has a name, I don't have it. It's a name that Americans use to buy what we call in Brazil as fluoxetine. And I think that maybe it's very important to address these issues. Maybe the solution to such problems is just psychological. And yeah, of course you can have a chemical treatment for that, but if you don't have the psychological treatment, I think it gets worse. I think it doesn't solve it. If I had to pick between the psychological and the chemical, I would say that in theory the psychological is the best one. But that's assuming that psychology is not a shitty profession that gets too out of reality often in these days. I don't know about the old days. I would say that Freud was a mistake for psychology. Oh yeah, I remember the medication that goes by fluoxetine here in America. It's called Prozac. Yeah, Prozac. I guess it's the same. From my twisted memory, it's the same. And I have this idea that if you can dose tobacco, you should smoke. And if you can dose caffeine, and I really mean just caffeine, probably more addictive than tobacco in my opinion. But if you can dose it, and if you're looking for the negative feedback, like acne and stomach problems, then you should do a self-dosage. And I think it's very effective, if of course it goes after the psychological treatment. But the thing is, the psychological treatment can be mostly initiated by the patient, and probably because he's the most interest and the most likely to know how his mind works, and he only needs some direction from the medical literature, given that he can look for the mistakes in his. If you're doing the behavioral cognitive therapy, he can look at the mistakes of his mindset and behavior. I think this, at least in theory, at least just by taking the meaning of these words, cognitive and behavioral, this is a very valid treatment. I think it's better than psychoanalysis, but I don't have more information on that. I know that psychology is actually very interesting if you are willing to take the time to look for the things, for the complex things and the scientific literature on that. You can look for articles on the internet and read them, which is possible by knowing English, probably even by knowing other language like German, and by looking on sites like Sci-Hub that make it possible for you to go over paywall, which is very often the case for important papers. And I've seen people argue against paywalls, and also argue against reading the papers that they use to make decisions. I think if there wasn't a way like Sci-Hub to get over the paywall, I think it would be still interesting to consider paying for the price, which is like $30, to read an article. Maybe that would make you motivated to read the whole thing, right? If you're not paying, you're just like skimming the text, and maybe you're not doing your best to extract a very solid information from that from those groups of people. Sometimes we're likely to skim text and not really understand or misunderstand something, and then later make some mistakes like poison ourselves just because we have like bad text comprehension, reading comprehension. I don't know, if you're talking about your health, I would go beyond the emergency cases, like I have a bad health, so I need to fix something because I'm sick, right? If we're talking about health, I would be more interested in going beyond that which is considered normal and healthy, like going and maximizing. I don't like this word to maximize because maybe there's not a limit, right? To maximize is like to give a lot of effort. Practically, that's the meaning of it. You don't necessarily know if there's a limit there, and sometimes we do know that there is no limit. For example, intelligence. We don't know that. We don't know if there is an infinite dimension of beauty or of possible human strength. But certainly, we know that intelligence is very, 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 very big, practically big, and it's theoretically infinite. Right? I would say that in the case of ADHD, my fix would be, for person. I think the people is unresponsive to bad things when they have ADHD, and I mean they happen to have like a bad situation going on, and they won't acknowledge it. Mostly they won't feel bad. They will like think that's a sadness, which is a very extreme state for them, and then there is like normal state, which isn't happiness nor sadness, and then there is euphoria, and they are more likely to tell other people that they are happy even when they are not, and they're mostly on this normal limbo state. That's what I came up with to call this state limbo state. And certainly, if you just take the small but solid step of calling this limbo middle state as a unhappy state, it is very likely that you will see yourself unlocking your ability to take action and to take the steps. I think maybe to teach people about this, we should just present them with a practical solution, right? So you just have to think, look, man, you're unhappy. You have to introduce this idea. Admitting is the first step in any direction, and not admitting is being stuck. But in the same time, we don't want to scare children with some weird stuff like this, and we don't also to associate with people that have real life problems like drugs and I don't know, people who live on the streets streets of Paris. We don't just associate with them. We just to motivate the kids to, you know, to do their homework. It's not even to do their homework. It's like more. It's to do their homework and do more and be interested in the discipline, in the subject of their correspondent schools. The kids should have a habit that is based on their initiative. And when you're talking about knowledge, it's okay to be made be made. It's okay for someone to compulsively force you to do some physical exercise, and I believe that in almost all cases leads to benefits if it's not overdone, like if it's not fucking with your heart or your muscles or giving you a lesion. If and that's not usually the case. So even if it's compulsive, it's okay. But I don't think it's okay to do some compulsive learning, compulsive teaching. That's horrible. You're very likely to reject that and to try to just mimic what the teacher is doing. You are very likely to not understand what is being done. You're very likely to forget, to not take things into your heart when you leave high school. Because ideally, think about it. Ideally, if people were really interested in school, then you wouldn't have a teacher for English and another teacher for geography and another teacher for mathematics. That wouldn't be the case. The case would be that you would have one teacher that is specialized in something, but is able to teach all the subjects of a school, of a high school, for example. And you might say, well, maybe that's not possible. So isn't it possible? Because I think it is. Since students are expected to learn all the stuff that the teachers are teaching them, then if students with very small heads, their small head volume, small body weight, small caloric output, if they are expected to learn all that stuff in a very short time, then I guess that a professional or a teacher, someone who has to learn as a profession, is very, very likely to learn that, learn all the subjects and be able to teach them all and not just specialize and fuck with a kid's head. Because that's the thing. If you have a teacher for each subject, it's very unlikely that you put it all together in your head, right? To do that, you have to think like, okay, so there is a hierarchy, and then there's science, and then there's sport, and then there is, in my case, there's Portuguese. In the American case, there's English class, and you should ideally be able to put it all together in your mind, and you shouldn't think of them as isolated cases, because they are all theoretically supposed to represent reality. And this conclusion comes from a thing called reality theory, which was developed in the 1980s, I believe. And since it has been like 30 years since the 80s, I guess it's very fair and square to have at least some schools, some private schools that teach it like this. And if I can go on the subjects themselves, I can go on mathematics. For example, the idea of mathematics and STEM in general is problem solving. Okay, that's the accepted and practical way of learning STEM, science, mathematics, and stuff. We could argue that no, we're learning this for knowledge, and I would love to hear that, because that's what I would like to go for. But since we are expected to be paid for using this knowledge, then we are in a very tight situation that revolves around problem solving. And the problem here is is that if you're not really learning how to solve problems in a very general sense, you're very likely to be dependent and very likely to lose your salary, your I don't know, maybe you're losing like more than half of your salary because you can't solve a few problems that your employer has to pay for someone else, like someone else in India, to do. And that's very troubling. I would like to make a comparison here. If you would see the size of a list of people who would be participating on the end product of something like a movie or I don't know, or some projects or books, you would see that the list was very, very much smaller than today. For example, my calculus book has a list of like, I don't know, it feels like 30, 50 people. And what used to be the case was that a book was created by one person. And everyone else was supposed to like help and make it more efficient, but the book was the responsibility of one person. And I think since that is not the case, I think that what's happening here is that people are losing the ability to do stuff in general, and they have to specialize. And they feel that they can't do a lot of stuff, and so they specialize even more. That's how I think it is. And when they try to improvise, they are very reluctant to admit their mistakes. That's very often the case. So it all adds up to a bunch of people who are unable to think and understand other people, right? So, for example, ideally, a mathematician should be able to speak with a physicist, and a physicist should be able to speak with a chemist, and a chemist. And since that is not the case, since what happens is you learn a bunch of stuff, and you learn to use words that are using the common sense with different meanings. Like in mathematics, you learn even in high school. For example, you learn about real numbers. Where does it come? Real numbers. There is actually a reason for that name, but that's very unimportant, right? Complex numbers. What is that? What about formal logic? Formal logic is supposedly the basis of mathematics, modern mathematics, and sentential logic is the most important thing here. And there are people who specialize in sentential logic, there are people who specialize in formal logic, and there are people who specialize in mathematics, and they are not able to speak with each other, with one exception for maybe the sentential logic one, because of the way he thinks. And that's a real problem. If you're going to look for the people who created science, they're mostly polymaths. They're all polymaths. They are able to do chemistry, they're able to do chemistry, physics, mathematics, geography. It's impressive. And I think that's enough. We're 20 minutes in. Yeah.